Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's discussion, the case for ending cannabis prohibition in Ireland. So this meeting is organised by People Before Profit. I think the debate tonight will be very, very interesting to hear, the case for ending cannabis prohibition and a wider debate that will happen over the next 6 months. I plan to bring forward a bill, Cannabis Regulation and Control Bill 2021, later on this year in the Dáil. So that will open a much wider debate, not only in society, but in the Dáil, where we can hopefully try to change the law, change perceptions about cannabis and so forth. So look, we're living in kind of strange times at the moment. And I think this is probably a welcome distraction in relation to COVID and so forth. So I think tonight's debate, I'm really looking forward to hearing the aspects of ending cannabis prohibition. So we'll hear them voices. So there's 5 guests tonight, and each one of them is going to introduce themselves in the next couple of minutes. So the first guest is Dr. Garrett Mc Govern. The second guest is Dr. Orfhlaith Campbell. The third guest is Ming Flanagan. Luke is an MEP. Fourth guest is Gerard Roe, and the fifth guest is Natalie O'Regan. So I'll be hosting the show. So I'm going to ask each of them, the contributors, to make us just introduce themselves, and then I'm going to put some questions to them over the next 40 minutes, and then we'll get questions from you, the audience, which is the most important thing, by text, and then I'll put that to the 5 guests. And if there's questions you want to ask me, go ahead and so forth. So I'm hopefully Garrett is there. Is Garrett there?
Yeah.
Garrett, how are you? Garrett, would you like to introduce yourself to the viewers tonight, just briefly, to who you are, and just briefly who you are?
Yes, my name is Dr. Garrett Mc Govern, and I am a GP specialising in addiction medicine. And I have been interested in the cannabis debate for almost 8 years, and I'm very heartened to see, Gino, that Luke Ming Flanagan is one of the guests tonight, because he's the man who started this ball rolling. We have a lot to owe to Ming, and steadily I've been very interested in it on 2 counts. One is on the medicinal side, goes without saying, being a doctor, but also on the recreational side, because on a day-to-day basis I see the harms of prohibition. And I would like to see a time where cannabis is regulated in the proper way, because all the evidence will tell us that proper regulation reduces harm, it doesn't increase it. So I'm really heartened to see that the medical cannabis access program is up and running. I have some kind of concerns about the restrictions, and you know what they are. Gino, you fought for this for long enough, and I really hope that people who need medicinal cannabis will be able to get medicinal cannabis, and that the conditions, the net will be widened in terms of the scope and the range of conditions that will be allowed. So I won't say very much more. I'm looking really forward to the evening, and I'm looking forward particularly to the listeners and viewers and questions. And it's great to keep this alive. And I think you're dead right, Gino. This is a welcome distraction compared to what everybody's going. I think everybody is suffering at the moment, and it's nice to bring this back onto the agenda again. So thanks for inviting me tonight. I look forward to it.
Thanks, Garrett. Orla, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Gino. Thanks for having me on. My name is Dr. Orfhlaith Campbell. I am a historian of Irish Prohibition. I'm currently a wellbeing worker for young people with the Simon community in Belfast, and I am a drug reform activist. But aside from all my academic and professional links to drug reform at the minute, I also lived in Vancouver when the change from the prohibition of cannabis to legalization. So I support medicinal use of cannabis and the recreational use, and it was a little bit of a culture shock coming back to Ireland and realising how intense the stigma still is. So I'm delighted to see that hopefully this is the first of many conversations going out there to normalise the conversation around cannabis use in Ireland.
Thanks, Orla. Luke, would you like to introduce yourself?
Luke Ming Flanagan is my name. I'm a member of the European Parliament for Ireland, elected in Midlands Northwest. I'm from Roscommon, and basically I have been interested in the legalisation of cannabis ever since I realised and seen the negative impacts that prohibition had on people around me and the general public. And as people probably know, in 2013, I had a cannabis regulation bill before Dáil Éireann. It got 8 votes at the time, and but the main thing about it was to get it on the agenda, get it discussed, get the national media talking about it, other than talking about the latest bust and the latest young fella that was caught with it or whatever, and to try and pull together a logical, coherent argument as to why prohibition doesn't work and why regulation and taxation is a much better option. And I'd say one of the main reasons I would say that we need to change this law is because at the moment, in the region of, the state can't give us a figure, but so I have to say in the region of 100,000 people in this country have a criminal record for possession of cannabis, and the impact that that has on them personally, whether that be from a point of view of applying for a job and having zero chance to get it if you fill in a job application form honestly, whether that be to do with travel, whether that be to do with having the rights to even see your children if you're involved in a separation, and that we need to change all that. And I think there's an opportunity to do it. I think there's more of an appetite for it now than there was in 2013. Ireland has done some extraordinary things since then. We have legalised gay marriage, and we have repealed the 8th Amendment and legalised abortion. So I think this time around, it's definitely a good time to do it. And I think there are so many reasons why we should do it that I'm going to stop now, because I could talk for weeks on why it should be done.
Thanks, Luke. Thanks very much. Gerard, would you like to introduce yourself?
I will indeed, Gino. And just like to say thanks for welcoming me on. And, I support the bill and your push for that. And, my name is Gerard Roe, everyone. Hello. And I'm a drug policy reform activist and a youth worker. And I've been using that platform to help shape and influence drug policy for the last 10 years. I've played a role in the decriminalisation debate, and where that is now, it's not fully realised as a health issue yet. It still rests in the criminal justice system, but that's not the topic we're discussing today. I've helped put harm reduction more firmly into the new drug strategy. And I suppose my interest in this is both personal and professional. I lost both of my parents to addiction. And in my professional life, I see the devastation and consequences that drug prohibition causes in the communities I've worked in for the last 15 years. And I'm determined to try and change that, to end the wall of silence around this. And I think this is a great place to start. So thanks.
Thanks, Gerard. Fair play, pal. Natalie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Natalie O'Regan. I'm from Cork, and my background is I've done a law degree in UCC, and then I stayed on for another year to do a master's degree in law, where I focused on cannabis decriminalisation and the consequences of prohibition on cannabis users, namely in terms of the stigma that attaches to cannabis users and how that can negatively affect their lives. Aside from that, I'm a passionate drug policy reformist, cannabis legalization. I think now, as they were saying earlier, like Ireland has, we've legalized gay marriage, we have repealed the 8th. So we are a very socially progressive country. And I do thank Gino for bringing forward the bill this year, because I do think it's a hot topic. It's on people's minds. And I don't think Ireland can ignore the evidence for much longer and retain prohibition with any sort of valid reason behind it at this stage.
Thanks, Natalie. Thanks for. Okay. So my first question I'm going to ask, and this is probably the title of the meeting, is I'm going to ask the Garrett. Garrett, is there a case for ending cannabis prohibition in Ireland?
I think a better question is there a case for not ending cannabis prohibition? That's an easy question. No, there isn't. So there's every reason why we should end cannabis prohibition. As Ming says, 100,000 people whose lives have been immeasurably changed, just is not sustainable. Even on a basic level, even if nobody cares about those people, that costs money. That could be money that's used for better purposes. There's simply no rationale. The scheduling of cannabis has always really baffled me. Out of all the psychoactive drugs that one could use, I think even the most hardened cannabis hater, and there are a lot of them out there in my profession, particularly, there are a number of them. They can't really, with a straight face, say that cannabis scheduling is due to any evidence. It shouldn't be on the schedule at all, in my opinion. But the fact that it's as high as it is makes no sense. If people remember, I think in 2007, 2008 in the UK, they rescheduled cannabis again. It had gone from a Class B down to Class C, and then it went back up again. And one of the kind of fallouts of that was that David Nutt, Professor David Nutt, who had been pushing for many, many years for sensible drug policies. He lost his job as the advisor, the national drug advisor in the UK. So there is resistance to this, but I just think now in 2021, and bearing in mind we're now going to be entering a period of people are predicting, the biggest recession that we have ever known in anyone's lifetime may well be on the way. I hope it isn't, and I hope we can find a way out of this. But we're going to have to find ways now of saving money, and it just is simply unsustainable to continue to put people through the courts. I think Gerard there mentioned, and I'm delighted to see he's on tonight to speak. About the devastation that he sees on a kind of a daily basis, and what he's experienced, particularly among young people. Why are we criminalizing people? The recent report that Justice Sheehan produced, and people have called it the Minority Report, completely and utterly bypassed the evidence in relation to drug decriminalisation. He wants to resist any form of decriminalisation at all. He believes that our purposes in this country are best served by continuing to criminalise people. And we need no halfway house on this, no hybrids, no nothing. Drug possession for personal use should not be criminalised. End of. So, there's another debate, and I think people who are on tonight, I'm pretty sure, know the difference between decriminalisation and legalisation. But I think we have to stop hiding behind decriminalisation and being afraid to say legalisation. I'm not afraid to say it. I believe that drugs that are currently widely used should be regulated, and we will reach a time, not probably in my lifetime, I don't think, although I'm reasonably hopeful about cannabis, where all drugs at one point or another will be commercially available and regulated in the proper way and taxed in the proper way. So in answer to your question, and I'm sorry for going around the houses on it, I cannot see any good reason with any evidence behind it why we should continue prohibition, and certainly why we should be continuing to criminalise people, Gino.
Thanks, Garrett. Orla, I'm going to ask you the same question with a caveat that you were living in Canada for a period of time, particularly around when prohibition was lifted. So, I asked you the same question. Obviously, I know what the answer is going to be, but I will propose the same question to you.
Yeah, so I totally agree with Garrett. I think we need to stop or get over the fear of saying that we support legalization of all drugs. At this point, prohibition has to go, but prohibition is the problem. Decriminalization is good because it helps stop criminalizing people, but it's only getting us halfway there. The black market still exists. It has to go for full legalization. So I would say, yes, there is a case for ending prohibition, and it's not only cannabis prohibition, although it is with cannabis prohibition that we need to start now in Ireland. But in order to be able to do this successfully, we have to understand what prohibition is. So before I get into living in Canada, Gino, I'm just going to answer a little bit about the history of prohibition, because I think that offers like a much bigger context and a bigger understanding of why we have to remove it. The war on drugs that we have now is a symptom of the prohibitionist ideology that a drug-free world is attainable. The original temperance and prohibition movement of the 19th century is the cause of that symptom. None of it is based on any medical or scientific research whatsoever, and it is nothing but a classist and racist system that is designed to oppress. It simply has to go. Prohibition grew out of the temperance movement, which began in America in 1826, and that rapidly transitioned to right here in Belfast in 1829. The Reverend John Edgar, he pours his family stash of whiskey out onto the street, and the campaign for the destruction of the drink trade has started here in Ireland. But by the time the UK and Ireland enact cannabis and other drug prohibition later in the 20th century, we're completely displaced from our prohibition history, and we've came to believe kind of at that point that prohibition was only something that happened in America in the 20s, and it caused flapper skirts and speakeasies, but that was it. Essentially, we had, and for the most part still have, forgot that we asked the prohibition question in Ireland. Dr. Shane Butler, when talking about 20th century drug policies in Ireland in 1991, says it would not be accurate to say that alternative perspectives were rejected by Irish policymakers. There is no evidence to support that it was ever discussed at any level. Policymakers have been largely unaware of it and believed that the American ideas of the need for an all-out war on drugs were taken as self-evident and sufficient. That's not good enough. The American war on drugs is a racist system that was used to control, criminalize, and oppress. America used its global power throughout the 20th century to force member states of the UN into submission, and we should not have prohibition in Ireland. Prohibition was contested here for almost a century. There was much pushback against the idea that there was something morally wrong with a recreational drink, and there was opposition from big business and trade unionists who opposed the destruction of a trade. Irish temperance and prohibition is also the context in which James Connolly would have grew up. Socialists like Connolly were fundamentally opposed to prohibition as it scapegoated alcohol for all the horrors coming from the developing system of capitalism. It's important to remember that Connolly himself was a total abstainer, but he did not believe that he could force others to live how he chose. Essentially, prohibition had its roots in attempting to control the working class so it could build a more sober and reliable workforce to build the capitalist system. And the toll that system took on the bodies and minds in terms of long working hours, dangerous working conditions, poor living conditions, and lack of nutrition would have caused an unprecedented level of trauma that could have led to problematic substance use. But instead of seeing the toll that the system was taking on the working class was gaslit into believing that all social issues would disappear if they could just control their inherent weakness for alcohol. So it wasn't the system doing it to them, it was them doing it to themselves. So when you look back and you think of James Connolly sitting in a pub with his soft drink, talking to his working class comrades with their substance of choice, really that was an intentional two fingers up at temperance and prohibitionists who, for the most part, he thought were deluded. Prohibition was a classist system based on a Victorian ideology obsessed with self-control. That people continued to consume alcohol throughout the 19th and 20th century, tormented total abstainers who thought that everyone could be convinced to give up drinking. Prohibition came about as a way to force those who could not listen into submission, and there was a desire to control those who could not be convinced to live by prohibitionist standards and codes of behaviour. This was never denied, nor was the attempt to enforce a middle-class code of behaviour onto the working class, who they viewed as morally and intellectually weaker. But the difference between the original prohibition movement and the war on drugs is that the original prohibition movement focused on ease and reasons for demand. So this is where we get coffee houses from in Ireland. They were started here as an alternative to the pub. But the supply-focused war on drugs has cut out all of that research, and it's cut out the provision of alternatives. and therefore it's cut out effective methods of prevention and recovery, as it's developed supply reduction and total abstinence as the only and ultimate goals. This is even more problematic now, as supply reduction has for the most part just moved into crime reduction, and we have the guards and the PSNI who are showboating seizures despite the scientific evidence that shows that this does nothing but ignite turf war, increase violence, increase price, and put our most vulnerable community members at increased risk of exploitation. So we have this wealth of historical research here in Ireland, and I believe that it is vital that we look back and take that all into consideration. That will enable us to meet our needs better, as opposed to enforcing a system that was built on bias and discrimination against working class, immigrant societies and communities of colour, as developed by America in the 20th century, and which continues to be the linchpin which enables police brutality, like we've seen in the Black Lives Matter movements, both in America and in Ireland recently. So now at this point, 167 years after Prohibition was first mentioned on this island, we can safely say that it's been tried every which way possible. It does not work. It's sending the market underground, it is keeping it in the hands of organised crime gangs, and it is leading to a contaminated supply by blocking market regulation. Prohibition is leading to the criminalisation and stigmatisation of young men and women in this island. It's blocking them from homes, houses, families, treatment services, travel opportunities, to name a few. But it's not simply that it doesn't work. Prohibition is an unjust and unbiased law that is placing restrictions on our recreational and medicinal freedoms, and it's therefore placing restrictions on our civil rights. Cannabis use is a reality, drug use is a reality, and the current system of prohibition that denies that reality is not fit for purpose. It never was, it never will be, and it has to be reformed now.
Thanks, Orla. Thanks very much. You have a huge amount of historical context into relation to prohibition. Gerard, I'm going to ask you the same question, with again another caveat. As a youth worker, how do you see where kind of criminal gangs kind of fill the vacuum of supply and demand? And obviously that's, we see it in our own communities there. It's very kind of insidious that's going on. But is in your eyes, is there a case for ending cannabis prohibition in Ireland?
Yes, there is indeed, and as Garrett said earlier, I can't see a reason for keeping it. For the last 15 years, I've been doing youth work, and I haven't seen prohibition make a blind bit of difference in the communities. All I've seen is the communities, be under siege by criminal gangs, and then the policing along with that creates this tension, and it promotes fear and instills fear and stigma, and they rule the sorry, I'm getting a bit nervous here actually. So yeah, I just think that cannabis prohibition is causing more harm than cannabis ever could to young people, and the relative harm. Excuse me. Gino, will you go on to the next speaker? I have to myself. Yeah. Sorry about that, everybody.
No, but Gerard, just say, for example, obviously criminal gangs have the market sewn up and so forth, right? If prohibition, if cannabis was legalized tomorrow, that would take, I suppose, they fill a vacuum. If that vacuum was all of a sudden it was filled by regulation and control, what would that look like, on the street or like in society, as to say?
Well, one thing that I've what I get from the parents of young people all the time is that they're absolutely terrified that their 16-year-old is going to end up on the street corner. Now, I'm doing this work long enough, and I work with 10 to 24-year-olds, and I want to stop losing young men at the age of 15. They're leaving youth work, So I think that regulating and controlling cannabis will take young people off the street, and we can, it'll make a significant dent in the criminal operation. There will be other drugs, but there'll be less drugs then to actually police in the community, because cannabis, in terms of harms caused to young people, it doesn't justify continuing with this policy. There's too much of a human cost,
Okay. Thanks, Gerard. Luke, I'm just going to ask you the same question in relation to, is there a case for ending cannabis prohibition? Obviously, I know what the answer is going to be, but
well, I think you were asking before we come in here, like a good question, and I kind of addressed it earlier, but I think there's an important point in what has changed since 2013. And in 2013, when I was doing this bill, one of the big arguments was, well, how do you know this won't go monumentally wrong? And you didn't really have an awful lot of evidence of a successful system at the time. Obviously, you had Colorado and Uruguay, but now you have examples of how it worked. You're not just talking about a theory, you're talking about something that factually has happened. The danger that if you legalized it, that everyone would end up using it and everyone would end up using 20 times more of it, that has not happened. The idea that it would lead to more drug usage in minors, that hasn't happened. The idea that it would lead to more problems, that hasn't happened. So from that point of view, arguing about it now is a little bit easier because you have a working example of how this can be done well. And I think that the last speaker made a brilliant point, like that, and I think it alludes to the point that, you know, cannabis isn't perfect. Like nothing is perfect. A knitting needle in the wrong hands, you know, in my grandmother's hands, it was one hell of a jumper, but in the wrong person's hands, it's a murder weapon. But the point that the last speaker made about the dangers of it being illegal are actually far more dangerous than anything cannabis could ever do to anyone. I think that's a very, very strong point, because the illegality of it, the problems that it causes are phenomenal. And one of the major problems I think that it causes and would disappear in a big sense is young people's attitudes towards the law and young people's attitudes towards the Garda Síochána. Because, and I used to hang around with a group of lads who we used to never get in any other trouble. But then when we started using cannabis, all of a sudden we weren't actually just criminals. We kind of got into the mindset of being criminals. We kind of went, well, maybe it isn't so bad being a criminal. And because if this is what it's like being a criminal, well, it isn't the end of the world. And if cannabis had been legal, I would never, ever, ever have entered that mental state. And I would still be the pain in the ass who ring the guards if I seen someone without their seatbelt on or whatever. I was very much into law and order, I have to admit. And then when I seen this, I was like, well, hold on a minute, this makes a bit of a joke of it. So I think one of the strongest arguments for getting rid of prohibition would be, I think it will leave an awful lot more young people with a lot more respect for the law. And then if they see crime in their area, they don't have this mentality that I'd be a snitch if I went to the guards, because, you know, you hear a lot of that talk around people who smoke cannabis. Are you going to grass this one up or that one up? That mentality would be gone. And I think it would lead to a better relationship. And it'd make it far more likely that a young lad would go to the guards if a crime was committed in their area. But if you smoke cannabis and you're a criminal yourself, you're less likely to. So that would lead, I think, to a phenomenal change. And it would be a really good thing. Like, you've obviously got the issue of revenue that you get from it. And in my bill, I specifically pointed to the idea that all of that revenue would go towards drug treatment, would go towards funding the whole thing. So you wouldn't be taking any money out of any other areas. And it would make far more sense to have that money in the taxpayer's pocket than to have it in, well, certain gangsters' pockets. And let's remember who in this country would have the biggest problem with repealing prohibition on cannabis. Who would be the most annoyed? High-class criminals. Well, let's piss them off, is what I say.
Okay, Luke, thanks. Natalie, the same question to you. is there a case for ending cannabis prohibition in Ireland?
Of course there is. And I think anybody that's tuning in here tonight, you're probably talking, it's like preaching to the converted. It's the people listening are probably not the people who actually need to hear this conversation. But like picking up what Ming was saying a while ago, the amount of people that are criminalised by cannabis prohibition in Ireland, the 2019 figures alone suggest around 14,500 of people that were criminalised for personal possession of drugs, not just cannabis. And that represents 70 to 77% of all controlled drug cases every single year.
Okay.
The harms that come from prohibition and from criminalising cannabis users are causing more damage than cannabis can ever cause to any individual. And I think one part of that would be the stigma that they were talking about that attaches to people who have been criminalised. And I think in a way that this stigmatization has almost been weaponized in the war on drugs. The stigma in some aspects can be the most degrading part of punishment. You don't need to be put into a prison cell to be a criminal. The label attaches to you, you go back out into society, and now all of a sudden the whole community thinks of you as a criminal. And I think this criminal label that does attach and the stigma that attaches does have a lot of consequences on cannabis users. It can affect their relationship with their family. It can affect their relationship with the whole community in general. And as Ming was saying, or Ming Flanagan was saying, you kind of embrace this criminal label. You become the criminal. It becomes your master status. If everybody else is going to think of you as a criminal, then why not just live up to it? And I think if you take away, like in Portugal, they have decriminalized drugs. And they have seen a great success with it in terms of the stigma that's attaching to it. And by removing the stigma from cannabis users, they don't feel rejected by society. They don't feel like a criminal. They're welcomed, like you welcome them with open arms back into society. It's almost outcasting them. It's throwing them out of society. And it's making cannabis users become more criminal than they ever dreamed of becoming before. And I think once you remove that criminal label and remove the stigma, it can improve the quality of life for all cannabis users. Like the stigma even attaches to medicinal cannabis that you don't get for any other medicine that's based off an illegal drug that we have now. And I think the other argument to end prohibition would be the taxation, the money, the revenue. Like a report that came out 10 or 15 years ago stated the cannabis market alone was 370 million or 375 million. That, like, if you look at Colorado, has a very similar demographic. I think their population is about 5.5 million. Last year alone, they made $1 billion from cannabis revenue. I mean, $1 billion going into the revenue. And as Luke was saying, you're not taking money off of other well-needed services like mental health or hospitals. You're not taking money off that. There's enough money going back into the revenue to pay for any social consequences that does come from legalizing cannabis. But when you consider it with alcohol or tobacco, I think the social consequences and the burden that may be on the revenue is a lot less than alcohol or tobacco.
Okay, good. Thanks, Natalie. Just to ask any of the guests, is there a model out there, like a country, where it's, it has the best practice, best outcomes in relation to, legislation, control, and tax? Is there a kind of model that people look to say, look, we need to be more like them? Obviously, we mentioned Colorado, Uruguay, I know a little bit about, but is there a country or a state where, this is what we should try to replicate? Is there anybody like to answer that?
I think Ireland is in a unique position to make our own. Like, we are an island, we have Northern Ireland, we have the Republic of Ireland, we are in the European Union. And I think it's a perfect opportunity to take all the good bits from every other country out there that have legalized it, take all the good bits. We can see from their mistakes, we can see the evidence from those countries. And I think we're in a perfect opportunity in Ireland to forge our own way forward with cannabis legalization.
Yeah.
Garrett, Sorry, Arlie, go on.
No, I was just going to say I totally agree with Natalie in that, one of the things, again, you can learn from the development of the history of temperance and prohibition is that we were late to the game with the development of temperance and prohibition. But once we realised something had to be done, because they were right in that something had to be done with the overconsumption of alcohol, kind of similar to what we're saying now. But we're late to the game, but by the time that we realise that we have to do something, we look around the world and we see examples of best practice, we see strengths and weaknesses, and we take the little bits and build our own temperance and prohibition movement here. That temperance and prohibition movement still exists in Ireland to this day, just because of the successful movement that they were able to build. So we need to look around the world and see examples of best practice. One thing I would say is that Canada is what not to do. One of the big things that they didn't do in Canada was deal with the fear of intoxication that is ingrained in society. So I think there's two levels of overcoming prohibition, and that's one is at policy level and the other is at the community. The temperance and prohibition movement in Ireland, it went into schools, churches, workplaces, the education spreads out, and that's why we are terrified of intoxication. They did not answer this. They did not deal with that fear in Canada when they were going through the legalisation process over there. So their aim was to legalise without normalising. That is still prohibition thinking, and that's going to be the same problem over and over again. So it goes back to that you have to normalise drug use. And when we normalise drug use, then we can overcome prohibition, and then we can develop systems that will protect and build a clean supply and a safe supply, and then have person-centered treatment for those that need it. Also, remembering that only 90% of users have no issues, 10% do. So we need a system that is more fit for purpose, and we can only do that by looking at our own unique context in this island, seeing how we can start to overcome the harms that prohibition is causing now, and how we can build a new Ireland that doesn't have prohibition in it at all.
Can I put a question to probably everybody? And I had this conversation numerous times with other TDs and obviously other individuals as well. And they said, well, if you make it legal, more people will use it. Now, is there evidence that where countries have legalized cannabis, where you can go into a store, go forth, has consumption gone up? Now, obviously it has. I mean, you would think that if something becomes more legal in a shop, it's consumed more but safer. But some of the opponents of cannabis legalization say, well, look, if cannabis was legalized tomorrow, everybody be smoking it. Now, could anybody address that? I'm being devil's advocate, but I think it's a legitimate kind of, I suppose, question that people have to ask.
Yeah. Gino, I'll come in here because sometimes I think prohibitionists will think of the children narrative, and use that in a way to kind of justify their agenda. But in terms of increases in drug use in other jurisdictions where they have legalized cannabis, they haven't really seen a significant rise in teenage drug use. If anything, it is stayed the same, or it's actually reduced. So that's to answer that question,
Okay, thanks, Gerard. Garrett, look, I'll get you next.
Gerard's absolutely right. There's no evidence that more sensible drug policies, particularly in relation to the specific issue of legalizing cannabis in the jurisdictions where it's been legalized, doesn't cause an increase in drug use, and even if it was an increase, it'd be negligible in some of the areas. And more importantly, it doesn't cause lots of problems in young people. Now, unfortunately, and Gerard used Twitter, so you know what I'm talking about, there will always be people that skewer the evidence and print some sort of study, which is usually written by people who have an agenda against cannabis, to say that, I saw one argument saying that cannabis legalization hasn't worked in Canada because the black market still exists. I mean, that is the most ridiculous argument I've ever heard in my life. Bearing in mind, if that is the case, if the black market is still flourishing, of course it's going to flourish for cocaine and heroin and a lot of other drugs, then the regulation isn't ideal. And we have to remember this: if we're going to make cannabis regulation work and snuff out the black market, we're probably going to find it difficult to do it unless we do it for a lot of other drugs. But if we're going to do it in relation to cannabis, and alcohol is a great example. I'm old enough to remember the days when people used to go across the border to Newry to get alcohol. Why? Because it was too expensive down in Ireland. And we can't have a situation where it is actually cheaper and easier to get it on the black market. We have to make it affordable for people. Otherwise, it will not work.
Fair play, Garrett. Luke, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, just in relation to the usage rising if it's legalized. Well, in the Netherlands, I know they haven't legalized it and they have this policy of tolerance. And initially, the amount of usage did go up. And you would say, well, the novelty. But over time, it has actually ended up, the usage is actually less than it is in the Republic of Ireland. And usage in Colorado initially went up, but now from the figures I have, it's something similar. But there's also the displacement of the use of other drugs and more harmful drugs by people who previously wouldn't have used cannabis and would have ended up drinking less. And also they have discovered people using an awful lot less opiates as well. So the fear that more and more people will use it, well, that's back to this thing of, well, how will we know if we do this? Well, now we do know, and we know that actually it doesn't lead to a massive spike in usage. And very importantly, and I can tell you, I go to the Netherlands every now and then myself when I'm in Belgium, and every now and then you might go to your regular spot and it won't be there anymore. And all you have to do is ask why. And the case is always said it was closed down because they sold it to minors. And if people are worried about young people getting their hands on mind-altering substances, they should remember that street dealers don't have to ask for identification. They do if it's legal. And some people had said they do it anyway. It's a very lucrative business to risk it just so you can make a few extra quid off minors. Well, people don't do it. And if you have a strong enough, and in the bill that I had, if you have a strong enough deterrent to that, it will make it very difficult for young people to get it, and definitely more difficult than your man who'll sell it to anyone. And when he doesn't have it, he'll sell them something else.
Luke, I just want to ask you a question. Do you think things have changed since you put that bill forward in 2013? I know you did kind of...
Yeah, oh, definitely, without doubt. Part of it would be the work that you've done yourself on the medicinal cannabis and what Vera Toomey has done. And I have always been wary of going near the medical cannabis issue, not because I don't believe in it, not because I don't think it should be legalized, but because my first entry into this whole topic was for recreational cannabis. And the last thing you want is people coming out with this argument that you only want it legalized for medical reasons. So wink, wink, then it'll be legalized for other reasons. And, you know, you could make that argument. But there was a sea change. I traveled down to meet Vera on her journey from Cork, from her house to Dublin. And this is the massive change I've seen. I know it was medical cannabis, and I know it's different to recreational cannabis, but I never thought I'd see the day that you'd have the local kids in a band marching in front of someone who was on their way to Dublin to demand that medical cannabis be legalized. And that has led to a change. I know there are different issues, but it's led to people going, you know what, maybe I'll have a bigger look into this. And it's made people more tolerant, not just of the idea of medical cannabis, but also the idea of recreational cannabis as well. So I think that has changed. Even though they're separate topics, it has led to a change in people's minds, you know.
Thanks. Natalie, did you want somebody?
Yeah, just on the topic of figures and usage going up, it's just important to remember that the figures that we have now, because cannabis is illegal, are self-reported figures. So there's a lot of people out there that would use cannabis recreational or medicinal that would not report their usage. So the figures that we have now are way out of whack. They do not show the real level of cannabis usage in Ireland. So when it does become legal, those figures are going to skyrocket because you're going to have the fear of criminalization removed. So people are going to openly admit to using it.
Okay.
Very good point.
Yeah. I have one question here from Mark Egan, and he actually says, good question in relation to what I would term corporate cannabis. He says, if legalized, should big business be allowed to dominate the market with, like Starbucks, shops selling coffee, well, what he's trying to say is like big corporations like Starbucks, if it was legalized tomorrow, corporations, if it's very, very lucrative and very profitable, will come into the market. I suppose, is that inevitable that will happen, or can we stop that from happening?
I don't think
I think it's inevitable.
Yeah. Orla,
I don't support legalization in Ireland if it's done in the interest of big corporations and the billionaires and the capitalists out there. This needs to be done in the interest of the community, and that's to restore some of the damage that has been done for the last 50 years to this country and the young people that have been dragged through the justice system needlessly. And then the revenue and the taxation from that needs to fund our social programs. It needs to fund youth services. It needs to fund addiction services. It needs.
Orla, do you want to kind of answer that?
Yeah, no, I would completely agree with what Gerard was saying there. It's not inevitable, and I think that really makes it more important that we speak up and fight now, so corporate cannabis can't step in and make big money. This is a civil rights issue. The restrictions on our medical and recreational and medicinal freedoms has to be overcome. So those of us on the left who see this as a social justice issue really need to fight to make sure that cannabis market is set up so that money is going back into treatment services and communities who need them, and to start rectifying the harms that have been caused by prohibition. I would actually say that the division as well between medical and recreational is a symptom of prohibition, because of that fear of intoxication when this system starts. To go after recreational use, they start attacking medicinal use of alcohol at the time. We then start to do that with cannabis as well. So, the way out of that has been to re-establish the medical use of cannabis, but I don't think that can ever be at the detriment of recreational use, because there is medicinal wealth to recreation in and of itself. If prohibition is about control in the working class, that was about control in our recreation, so we would be sober enough to go to work on Monday morning. So that, recreational and medicinal is all the same, and that plays into the corporate, cannabis companies coming in and taking over, and we have to fight so hard to make sure that this is for social justice and this is to rectify those harms that were caused by this top-down system.
Gino?
Yeah, Luke, on.
Yeah, I think I think in the world that we live in and the way it is structured from a business point of view, there is a danger that they would dominate, and I think that needs to be built into regulation and into the legislation. And the bill that I had in 2013, we had a commercial cultivation license. There was a home cultivation license whereby you'd be able to grow 6 plants yourself, and there were certain conditions around it. And we were particularly strict in this bill on a lot of different things because, we were thinking of the children because someone else was going to say it. So we thought of it first. So basically, we wanted to put something together that would, anyone who was worried about that aspect of it, it was closed off. What we're on about here is, could it be done, and what way could it be done? So the idea of a home cultivation license was proposed as well, and also the cannabis social club license. And in experience as a cannabis user, and my experience as someone who's looked at this, I have to say I think the best model I seen was the cannabis social club. And under that system, and what we proposed at the time, and it's similar to one of the clubs I was in Barcelona, is basically the club would get a license to grow 300 plants, and they would be growing them for you, in a sense, for the 50 people who were a member of that club. And you would pay a certain fee. It wouldn't be for profit. And you go in then and you get to experience a few different varieties or whatever in a safe environment. No one is making any profit out of it, but it helps people who, some people have this idea, if it's legalized, I'll just go out and grow it. Well, you could go out and grow an awful lot of stuff, but some people aren't very good at growing things, unfortunately. And everyone goes, oh, it's really simple. Well, it isn't necessarily that simple either. It can be complicated enough in certain ways. So in order to prevent this idea of big multinationals taking it over, I think definitely a route would be the Cannabis Social Club. And for a regular commercial license, that you limit it to a certain amount, so you can only get so big. Now, then you'd be running into probably other problems with other laws or whatever. But I think you should go with the commercial license, go with a homegrown license, and the whole idea that you can have it in social clubs. And that way, then the public can decide, like, if you are of the mind, I don't really no more than I prefer to buy me bread in Benny's in Castlereagh than I do in Lidl, you make that choice. And then it's up to people like me and Gino to bang the pulpit and say, support the local guy or whatever. But there is a danger that big business will take it over. Look, if there was money in selling human urine as a fizzy drink, they'd be in there and they'd be selling it and they'd be making maximum profits out of it. No matter what it is, they will try and make money out of it. And there's a lot of money in this. But so, yeah, try and cut them off at the pass. That's what you can do with legislation.
Thanks, Luke. Just I'm going to read out a few questions. There's a question here from Amy Brown. So it's a question to you, Garrett. There's obviously a lot of people, well, I suppose people use cannabis for all sorts of reasons and so forth, medicinally and so forth. But there is a cohort of people that use it for pain, and it's quite effective. And I think what Amy says, she's had obviously a bad experience in relation to her own situation. I think what she's trying to say is that, like, could you see a situation where cannabis could be available if legalization is not going to happen, where cannabis could actually be available via a prescription under like a medical cannabis kind of the access program?
Yeah, well, I was going to make the point actually that I don't want to burst people's bubble, but we're not really anywhere near legalization of cannabis. I think the two low-hanging fruits are decriminal cannabis use for personal use anyway should be decriminalized tomorrow, and I think medical cannabis should be available for anyone who gets a benefit. So in answer to your question, it is absolutely senseless that medical cannabis can become available in this access program for a limited number of conditions. Chronic pain is probably the biggest and strongest evidence base of the evidence available, and yet, and it's easily the biggest symptom. It's not really a disease, chronic pain. It's a set of symptoms as a result of other illnesses. I see no reason why people with chronic pain should suffer chronic pain. That HPRA report from a number of years ago that just completely airbrushed chronic pain out of the indications, that needs to be rescinded, reversed, and looked at again. So it should be available right across the board for whatever medical benefit people get, not restricted to the small number of conditions. And also, I would change the consultant-led program to be any doctor in these islands that is willing to prescribe, can prescribe. And in fact, I go a step further than that, and this isn't going to happen. I read the hands of, if you look at medical cannabis compared to any other medications, and listen, I treat heavy-end heroin users. Ger works in, with marginalized communities. We see the perils of drug use every day. We prescribe many drugs with huge huge side effects. Medicinal cannabis, to me, from what I can gather, is pretty much as close as you can get to side effect free. I don't know what we're worried about. There is no Trojan horse. That is a complete myth. The idea that you would go and take medicinal cannabis and in some way it'd be a road to rack and room to recreational cannabis is senseless and nonsense. So low hanging fruit first, decriminalization and medicinal cannabis to all who need it.
Okay, thanks, God. Just Amy has kind of sent a question back, and I probably kind of paraphrased her wrong, but she says, I suppose, how do we go about having a conversation about legalization in general? And I think that can happen, obviously, that has to happen politically, because in order to change the law in the country, you have to put a bill forward, because I don't see the government putting a bill forward. I actually had an interesting conversation with Leo Varadkar about legalization before Christmas, and I mean, I think he said it publicly, and he said it before, that he doesn't see the sky falling in relation to legalization. So on a personal basis, there is a lot of TD. I think there would be a sizable amount of TDs from the more conservative parties that would, in some sense, agree with ending prohibition. But that's only on a personal basis. Now, obviously, that will be tested probably in the summertime when I put the bill forward. And the bill is quite similar to Luke's. There will be a few changes in relation to the bill itself. But I think if we need, what I'll do is, in some ways, I have one eye on in relation to the debate around decriminalisation, because that has been bandied around for the last 20 years. And what they're talking now is that the decriminalisation debate should go into the Citizens' Assembly. But the Citizens' Assembly actually can't meet at the moment. And when can that debate happen? So we will definitely put the bill forward this year. But my kind of question to myself, do we put the bill before the debate around decriminalisation or after the debate around decriminalisation? And we don't know what the kind of the end result of the debate around decriminalisation will be. But I think we need to go much further and have an honest debate in the Dáil and see where parties are at. Ironically, the only party that I can see besides People Before Profit that have a very coherent policy on ending prohibition is the Green Party. Actually, their doctrine is very good, but they're in government, so they might be in kind of a bit of a tough spot there. So, but I think it's going to be an interesting debate what will happen over the next 6 months. So my next question, this is from Rick. Why is there so little political will to legalise amongst Irish politicians? Now, obviously, I tried to answer that. Luke, I might come to you. Why do you think in Ireland, your experience, there has been a kind of hesitancy in relation to not kind of mention the C word? Obviously, it's a bit easier to say the C word now, but in your time, it was probably saying the C word. It was like, it was pretty. It was like devil worship.
Yeah, I find it very hard to get my head around because I'm so biased, and I believe I'm right. I believe I'm correct in my argument. So I find it very hard to get my head around why someone wouldn't. And I can only think that it's because they are afraid that it will affect them politically. Now that's what I think. But that logic on that does not stack up, because I'd love to know what society they're living in if they think that would damage them politically. And I think maybe also they're afraid of, some people find it very hard to admit they're wrong. Sorry, everyone finds it very hard to admit they're wrong. And politicians admitting they're wrong can be accused of being like a candle in the wind and not very assertive in what they believe in. So all of these people that we'll be dealing with will at some stage have had some press release in their paper talking about the dangers of drugs and how it was going to destroy us all. So now to say other words would be a challenge for them. But like from the point of view of being able to make an argument for it, and from the point of view of it damaging them politically, that shouldn't matter anyway, but that's the way politicians think. But it doesn't damage you, because I come from Roscommon. We voted against legalizing gay marriage, but they still didn't balk at voting for me, because I didn't only say I wanted cannabis legalized. I want all drugs regulated. I want the whole lot taken out of the hands of criminals. Did it stop me getting elected? No, it didn't. It didn't at all. And in fact, politically, it now means that around here, a lot of people who voted for me don't believe in legalization of cannabis. But I hope politicians would learn this. People will vote for politicians because they say stuff that they believe in and aren't worried that they'll offend you. And then a lot of people say to me, you know what, I don't agree with you, but at least I can believe you. So I think politicians are just scared, and we will come to a tipping point though, Gino, and I think we will see. I hope you're successful, and ideally it will pass. But my prediction is we will see a situation where it will happen all around the United States of America, and then one of the biggest political parties, I hope it's People Before Profit is the biggest political party at the time, will come out, and it will be their idea. And they will be the ones who thought about it, no more than gay marriage and repealing the 8th, because I sat in the Dáil when they attacked Claire Daly for trying to repeal the 8th. It is when it becomes their idea that it will happen. And I don't think that's very far away. But at the moment, they're still a little bit, they're scared. I don't know why.
Yes, but Orla, you knock it.
Yeah, I think Ming's hit a really good point on the head there. There has to be a willingness to admit that we're wrong if we're going to be able to move forward, and that includes all of us. That even includes myself. Years ago, I would have been at anti-drug rallies, or I would have had the wrong idea of what a drug was or what addiction was, and I've had experiences in my life where I've maybe stigmatized people because I didn't have that education at the time. That everything we have understood about drugs and prohibition up until this point has been taught to us. It's a learned behavior, so it does take a lot to overcome that. I think when we get to the politicians, there's a lot of fear that they don't want to maybe admit that they've been wrong, because they probably used a lot of this to gain votes at some point. But I also think I'm a little fed up with pretending that this conversation isn't a lot further on around the world, and that we're only starting it now, especially during COVID, when we were screaming at people to have the medical and scientific evidence, looked at, understood, and used to protect us. Well, the medical and scientific evidence is out there that prohibition has to go, and cannabis should be decriminalised, legalised, and regulated. Why we start that conversation here, pretending that that's not the starting point, I have no patience for that anymore. So, yeah, we need the politicians to get over the fear that's here, and just admit that we all made mistakes, and that we have to put bigger, better systems in place that will protect people.
Gerard, did you want to come in there? Gerard? No. Natalie, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just about the politicians, and I remember the general election, and I remember reading all the policy documents, and the Green Party had their policy document, and they wanted Dutch-style coffee shops, and they promised a citizens' assembly on the topic of drugs. And a lot of people would have voted for the Green Party based on their drug policy paper. There's a lot of drug activists out there that would have went, oh, finally, somebody is thinking about it. Somebody is talking about it, and somebody actually has a solution. And I think once they went into government, I think that was one of the topics that was dropped from the programme for government. It was one of the sacrifices that was made. And there has been nothing else. There's been no apology. There has been no kind of excuse that came from the Green Party about why they haven't gone ahead with their citizens' assembly. And even I see it myself on Twitter and on Reddit and everywhere else. A lot of people out there, and they're not asking for much. They're just asking for a citizens' assembly. Let the assembly form. Let them hear all the evidence and let them put forward their opinion to the government. If nothing else, it'll educate the government on where the public lie and what the public's opinion is on. Because, as you were saying, politicians are fearful of making a mistake. They don't want to come out and say they support drugs and support cannabis legalization and then get the backlash for them. So let the Citizens' Assembly sit, let them put forward the public opinion, and the politicians will know then that you're not going to get a public backlash for it. You're not going to be wrong, because the majority of Ireland will actually be on the side of legalization of cannabis once the evidence and everything else is heard.
Garrett, can I put a question to you in relation to there's a very kind of irrational debate in the media about the harms of cannabis and so forth, and we understand, somebody that uses copious amounts of cannabis is just not good for their health, right? It's just like, that's very, very obvious. But there's there's other questions that have been kind of, I suppose, bandied about, that cannabis is as bad, detrimental to your health than heroin. Well, obviously that's not the case. But how do you see it in your profession in relation to how they kind of see cannabis use? Because when I was growing up, and this is fact, cannabis use was, people use cannabis, but the strength was much stronger now than it was, say, 15, 20 years ago. Most people were smoking hash. Most people are smoking like green grass, whatever you want to call it, weed, and it is stronger. So, in your profession, what's people's take on the consumption of cannabis in relation to their health?
Well, I've always maintained I try not to fight the cannabis and psychosis argument, because I tend to, when I hear anybody going on about psychosis and cannabis use and it's 6 times more powerful, and it's this and it's that and it's the other, I usually say in response, that sounds like an argument for legalization, for regulation. So I'm kind of sick of defending kind of, I know a lot of people who are real strong cannabis activists want us to believe that cannabis is completely harmless, and it isn't. I mean, I treat people who have problems with cannabis, but so what? I mean, I treat people who have high cholesterol. I treat people who don't take enough exercise. I mean, my feeling is, in my own profession, I don't think that they think about this deeply enough. I mean, I was going to make the comment, the night, and Ming will remember this, the night Ming's bill was downed, Ming will remember some of the comments and arguments put forward. And I think one of the reasons, Ming, actually your bill was defeated is that the people who voted against it didn't read it. Because the arguments that they put in favor of continuing for cannabis to be prohibited just made no sense whatsoever. Some of it was absolutely embarrassing. I thought it was an episode of Monty Python when I listened to some of the arguments put forward in relation to it. So people have what we call a party line in relation to this. There's a fear to tell the truth. I believe there's a lot of people out there, and I believe there's a lot of people in Dole Éireann and in the medical profession who actually agree with Ming Flanagan, agree with me, agree with you, and agree with all the speakers here tonight, but they are afraid to do it. And I think we need to break down the fear and show that it's fashionable to tell the truth about cannabis. It's fashionable and it's okay. Because in my profession, it's almost taboo. Nobody wants to talk about it. I mean, it's not even radical anymore, me talking about it, but with all due respect, I'm a lone voice. There aren't enough doctors talking about this and educating themselves. So as long as ignorance prevails, we'll never change cannabis. Cannabis will never be legal, in my opinion, if the medical profession shut up about it. It will never be legal. Because you will always get the voices in there, and I don't want to mention any names on this, but we all know who they are, who spend most of their time on Twitter maligning cannabis and telling lies about it.
Can I come in on that, Gino? There,
Yeah.
it is this whole thing about cannabis causing schizophrenia, certain types of cannabis causing schizophrenia, cannabis being stronger than it used to be. In a unregulated, in a prohibited market, whatever the drug is, in order that you can get it from A to B and deal it and supply it, you will choose the strongest, lowest volume product that you can get. So the stronger it is, the less of it you have to carry. The easier it is to put into an orifice, the easier it is to hide from people. So inevitably, whether that be exceptionally high alcohol drink that was going around in Prohibition in the United States, whether that be a very high THC, low CBD weed nowadays, this happens because of a lack of regulation. And not only that, cannabis users do not like this stuff, because I can tell you personally, there is some cannabis out there that does not make me feel great, because it has the wrong variety of cannabinoids in it for me. And I would much prefer to see a situation where before you took it, you could know what impact it was going to have on you. And if people could have that situation, no one would be going out buying this stuff that's as strong as poaching basically is to alcohol. And no one would be buying something that would make them feel uneasy. And anyone who did feel uneasy, having tried the variety of them, then they would definitively know that none of this suited them. But currently we have a situation where people have a smoke, and on that occasion they had a great time, and maybe on that occasion they weren't feeling great beforehand, it made them feel good afterwards. Then subsequently they chase that feeling for a long time in the future, and they get anything but that feeling because they haven't a clue what they're using. Whereas if it was regulated, they would actually know. And I know some people would say in the 80s and the 90s it wasn't as strong. Well, whatever about it being as strong, a lot of it didn't have any cannabinoids in it at all. A lot of it had psychiatric drugs in it. A lot of the hash that I would have smoked in my late teens, well, I know skunk weed isn't great, but all I can say is soap bar was total and utter filth in comparison to it. So if you regulate it, you'll definitely make it safer. In the same way as if we didn't have alcohol regulated, now a young person can pick up a volume of a liquid, it could be alcohol, it could be beer, and drink it. And then only after you're drinking it, you're absolutely wrecked. Who wants that? No one wants that. So in a regulated market, you would have a lot less of those problems. And finally, in a regulated market, if someone did have a problem with it, you'd be able to go and get help without the fear of getting a criminal record that would have your children taken off you, and I could go on. So regulation solves a lot of these problems.
Just a question to Gerard. Gerard, as a youth worker, is the use of cannabis widespread? No, I mean, obviously not all young people consume cannabis, but there's obviously a narrative out there that a lot of young people are using cannabis. Do you kind of see that as in your work as a youth worker?
Yeah, a lot of. Can you hear me? Because I'm going in and out of feed here. Yeah. That's a question. A lot of young people are using cannabis, and there are a lot of young people that aren't. But for the young people who are using cannabis, a lot of them are getting involved in dealing now as well, Gino. You know, so they're not only dealing and getting involved in the criminal gangs and whatnot, they're also getting their stuff online delivered to their door, so they can set up little enterprises themselves, you know. But cannabis use among young people is so high the length and breadth of the country, and in order to keep them safe, we need to regulate it, because none of that cannabis is regulated. You have no way of discerning the strength or the quality. So most young people think, all cannabis is the same, you know. But then there's even young people who have got more sophisticated with their cannabis use. As I said, they're buying it online, they're able to tell the strength, you know. So it's quite muddled, and I think the only way to bring that under control or do something about it is accepting we need to move into legalization, you know, and educate young people rather than criminalizing them. It's totally counterproductive. criminalising young people, in my experience, working in youth work for the last 15 years, pushes them further into addiction and into criminality. And to me, that is unacceptable. It's absolutely heartbreaking, you know. The situation is so out of control at the moment, and cannabis is flooded. The place is flooded with cannabis, you know, that it's starting turf wars, young people hungry for more money, power and status are warring with other neighbourhoods. It's just out of control. It's creating a situation that's really bleak in our communities. The place is getting very, very, very unsafe right now at the moment. Now, I work in the inner city, and there's been a lot of stabbings there for the last few weeks, you know. And these are all involving young people. Not everything is related to what we're talking about here, but some of those acts of violence are directly related to the illegal drug trade. And one of them is 100% that is cannabis. So cannabis is everywhere, Gino. A lot of young people are using it. And you know what? Our response in this country is not good enough. It's just not good enough. So I've been banging this drum for a long time in my sector, and all I encounter is a wall of silence. You know, people are afraid to speak out on this. I'm not. It gets me into trouble, but I'm not afraid to do it because I know what's happening to these young people. And I feel sometimes the wall of silence is down to, you know, there's a lot of people in paid positions that rely on this. Well, their funding is aligned to the enforcement of this issue, so they won't say anything. You know, that kind of way. You just like, just shift the topic on.
Yeah, poor Gerard's gone there. It's a pity, no? It's a pity. Okay. Look, we'll probably wind up in the next couple of minutes, but I'd like to get back to the last couple of contributions in relation to the issue. As I said, I'll put the bill forward in sometime this year, and that will start, I think, a good debate in relation to ending prohibition in Ireland.
I got cut off there.
Yeah, do you want to finish off what you said, Gerard?
Yeah, I got cut off. Where did I get cut off? Where was I? By the time I got cut off, I wasn't.
Right.
Yeah, so like I said, any ongoing discussion, we need to take this issue seriously. Continuing with prohibition is causing grave danger to young people, and the only way of actually, you know, dealing with this effectively is through legalization. You know, that's.
Thanks, Gerard. Okay, everybody, I'm going to wind the meeting up, and I'm going to ask you to come back for 1 minute to kind of give. I know we kind of probably answered this question at the start, and what would actually, you know, ending prohibition? What would it look like in Ireland? To me, what it would look like is that people that use cannabis, and not everybody uses cannabis, would be taken out of the criminal justice system. So you would not be criminalized for using cannabis, the cultivation and so forth. So there is huge benefits, even if you've never, ever used cannabis. When you put the evidence on the table to say, look, this is a plant, people consume it, regardless of what your sometimes class status, people will use it, and locking people up and using all the resources that the police have, civic society have, using all that, and at the same time, cannabis consumption is never as great as it was when the present drug laws were kind of invented in 1977. So, doesn't that say something about a drug that there's laws there to basically prohibit the cultivation, the consumption, anything, but more than ever, this substance, a plant, is more readily available than ever. So, obviously, you know, it's obviously, you know, the legislation that's there doesn't work, and in my opinion, the only way to, I suppose, address this issue is go beyond decriminalization, is legislation, control, tax it, regulate it, take it out of the hands of the black market, then you control it. Because at the moment, the government don't control zero, absolutely zero of the cannabis, for want of a better word, the market. Zero. You don't get any income from it, zero. So if that was changed, where people can go into a shop, adults, make informed decisions about whether they want to use cannabis or not. Surely that's a better way of regulating a substance such as that. So, Natalie, how would you feel about that situation? Grown-up adults in Ireland tomorrow, where you can go into a dispensary or a pharmacy, wherever you want to do, or grow some of your plants yourself. How would you feel about that? Where would you like to be in that Ireland?
Of course I would. Like, thankfully, I'm not green fingered. Anything I touch dies within 2 days. But like, we're all adults. Same with alcohol. Because you take a drink does not mean you're an alcoholic. Because you smoke cannabis does not mean you're an addict. And I've been saying it over and over again. Use does not equal addiction. This fear of everyone's going to become addicted, just, pardon my French, it's bullshit. Stop. It's not true. It's not going, these horrors that's predicted is not going to come true. I'd love to live in an Ireland where cannabis use is legal, where young teenagers are not getting criminalised the second they turn 18 from getting caught with a joint in their pocket walking down Patrick Street or O'Connell Street in Dublin. It's not affecting the rest of their lives. I'd love an Ireland where people that need access to medicinal cannabis can grow their own or can go to their GP and ask for a prescription for medicinal cannabis. That it's not the last resort when all pharmaceutical drugs are finished. It's a valid first option treatment. I don't think, bad news is, I'd like to be hopeful and think that we will legalise it in the next 5 years, but unfortunately it looks like we're stuck with this government for the next 5 years. So, pessimistic, optimistic, they're kind of fighting with each other at the moment. But I do think, if nothing else, it's going to educate the public. It's going to open the conversation. It's going to get people talking about it, get the stigma away from cannabis use, get the conversation flowing. It's going to make people go to their GPs and talk to their GPs about cannabis. A lot of doctors don't have any education on cannabinoids or the endocannabinoid system. If nothing else, it's going to open the conversation. It's going to get people going, and it's going to change attitudes. And hopefully in the next 10 years, we will be sitting in an Ireland that have legalised cannabis.
Okay, thanks, Natalie. Luke, are you optimistic or pessimistic about legalisation and the prohibition of cannabis?
I used to go through periods of being optimistic and pessimistic. When I started off at this in 1997, I was massively optimistic. Delusional is probably another word. Then when I seen what David Blunkett did, a man without sight showing more vision than all the men and women in the House of Commons with sight by decriminalising it, I had lots of hope, and then the hopes were dashed again. But I think things are changing. And I think what's happening, it shouldn't be this way, but I think because of what's happening in the United States of America, I think the election in Georgia is going to have more to do with legalization of cannabis in Ireland than your election or my election, unfortunately, will be a catalyst, all right. I think the fact that the Democrats now have control of both houses, the leader of both houses have expressed an interest in legalizing cannabis. I think it would happen in the United States of America and on a federal level. And I think when it does happen there, it will happen here sooner rather than later, because we will then see a situation whereby it will become normal in the same way as the silk stockings on the big cinema screens in the 50s in Ireland led to them coming over here because we wanted them. And the same warnings about them, it'll lead to Ireland falling apart and all the women will get pregnant, etc. We copy what we see in American culture. And you're going to see programs as benign as whatever the modern day Friends is, and whatever the modern day Fresh Prince of Bel-Air is, where it'll be there like coffee, it'll be there like Guinness, it'll be there like it'll be there as a normal thing. I think, in fact, I'm definite you will see it happen then, and I don't think that's going to be too far away. But what I can really see out of what you're doing, though, is it's going to educate a public that are ahead of the politicians as to which party and which politicians support this. And parties that in the polls at the moment show that in the demographics that they have a massive youth vote and a massive vote of people under the age of 40. It's going to show the public where they stand on an issue that they will probably agree with getting rid of prohibition on. So what you're doing now, you never know what's going to happen. You never know what a populist like Leo Varadkar would do to make himself even more popular. I don't think it'll happen this year, but you never know. But it's coming, and I'm not delusional anymore. It's coming.
Thanks, Luke. Orla, optimistic or pessimistic?
I'm optimistic. I lived through the change from prohibition to legalization in Canada. I've seen how this worked. You can interact with the plant, you can go see your bud tender, you can talk about, what's this strength going to do to me. Me, myself, I had mental health issues for some of the time when I was in Canada, and I was able to use cannabis both recreationally and medicinally. That allowed me to heal and overcome any mental health issues that I had, because there was no stigma. Coming back here to Ireland, and then if you continue to use, you're a criminal. You don't have the same options for medical care. I'm lucky that I was able to come home. That not everybody who needs medical cannabis is able to be at home in Ireland. I'm thinking of Alicia Maher at the minute when I say this. But I am very optimistic. I think Ming's right. I think we're going to follow what happens in America. We are in this position at the minute because we followed what happened in America, but the society probably is a little bit more ahead of the politicians in this. We have to get the information out there that when we were asked the question about prohibition before, we did not want that here because it was an infringement on our civil rights, that we just followed America in implementing a racist system. I think once we keep getting the information out there into society, and that the propaganda and the fear that we have on cannabis is directly linked to the fear and propaganda that was spread in alcohol, even down to the quote that it will increase violence and cause murder. It's a carbon copy. I think once we get that out there, it's going to happen a lot quicker. But yeah, I would say within the next 5 to 10 years, depending on what happens in America and in other places, finally forcing our politicians to do something. I would also say that, around 2016, when cannabis prohibition was changing in Canada, Leo Varadkar would have been very friendly with Justin Trudeau at that point. So I'm sure there would have been conversations about the legal cannabis market and the money that could be made on that. So I'd say the political establishment in Ireland at the minute is very aware of how the corporate market could step in there. So there could be a lot of faux fear at the minute as well being spread. But definitely within the next 5 to 10 years, it's changing. It's unsustainable and unattainable to keep it like this at the minute.
Thanks, Orla. Thanks very much. Gerard, optimistic or pessimistic?
Gino, I hope over cynicism any day, but I won't hold my breath. I wanted to happen yesterday, but I'm going to put 5 years on it as well. I want to live in a society that, stop stigmatizing and shaming people who want to use drugs, pushing them out, pushing them further into addiction and criminality. I want to stop criminalizing people for using drugs. It's a failed policy, it's causing more damage than it is good. You have to ask yourself whose interests are these laws actually serving, because they're not working and the people are ahead of the population. They're only a mechanism now to keep the working class and poor people in their place and cannabis users stigmatized. It's an absolute fallacy, and I think that it needs to come from the bottom up and not wait for the top down. We need to demand change. We need to get smart, build smart campaigns and build a narrative and a community and force this over the line. And hope with the changes internationally, they'll just have to do it, But I do think, with solidarity and really mobilising and getting it off the ground is how we're going to get this over the line. Because we're well more educated on this than our politicians are, or our judiciary. I didn't really give a good account of myself earlier on when you asked me the gang question, because I have a problem with them, but my gripe isn't with them. My gripe is with the justice system on this, Gino. They've created this problem. And it's up to them to fix this mess. And the best way to fix this mess is by ending all prohibition. And we can start with cannabis prohibition, because cannabis prohibition and decriminalisation, and as Garrett mentioned earlier on, to me, they are the three low-hanging fruits. And then we can deal with the more complex issue of harder drugs, dangerous drugs that kill people. But right now, I do not want to live in a society that continues to use cannabis prohibition as a means to control children, putting them in the justice system at the age of 10. My heart's breaking, Gino. It has to stop. You know, and I'm speaking out about this, and I want other people to take it seriously. We're all in this for different reasons, some selfish, some not. But for me, as a person who is embedded in the community, I see the damage and destruction that prohibition is causing every single day. And the relationship between the community and the guards is absolutely appalling, especially with the young people. It's like they're almost being groomed for the justice system and groomed for the criminal gangs. We have to intervene here. You know, for that reason alone is enough to end cannabis prohibition, because it's not working. So we have to ask, who interests are they actually serving? And we know who they are. So we need to demand change now, because the interests that they're serving are not to keep young people and communities safe. They're making communities and children very unsafe, and they're in clear and present danger because of it, you know. So yeah, I'm optimistic that we can change this, and I want to live in Ireland where it stops stigmatizing and shaming people who use drugs, you know.
Fair play, Gerard. Fair play. Garrett, last word with you. Optimistic or pessimistic?
Well, I'll answer it another way. Gino. I think the quicker other countries make us look more stupid and more bigoted, the quicker we'll get cannabis legalization. We had it with condoms, same-sex marriage, and repeal the eighth. We were shamed, I think, into changing those laws because they were completely inhumane. It was an injustice to people for many, 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 many decades and years. And I think we need to get to a stage where we're made look stupid by criminalizing people and making cannabis only purchased on the black market with the full might of the law. So if we don't like looking stupid in Ireland, I know that, we're intelligent people, but unfortunately in relation to cannabis laws, otherwise intelligent people, i.e. in Dáil Éireann in the medical profession, become completely stupid. So we need to stop being stupid and change the Misuse of Drugs Act.
Thanks, Gareth. Fair play. And that was a very optimistic note. I'd like to thank everybody that made a contribution tonight. Orla, Gerard, Natalie, Gareth and Luke. I think it's been a very, very good debate, and hopefully it will kind of spark a wider debate in society, which it always has, and it always probably will. I'm kind of optimistic. I think things are changing dramatically in Ireland, particularly around social issues and particularly around drug use. I think things are different than they were 5-10 years ago in relation to how we kind of view people that take drugs and that the harms that it does. And I think even the government have acknowledged the harm reduction, rather than putting people through the criminal justice system. So hopefully with the bill that I put forward this year, it will spark that debate, and parties that, are in opposition or possibly in government will support the bill to go to the next stage and get that kind of real debate going about the harms what prohibition is doing to communities and society as a whole. And as Gareth says, we just have to look at different countries and jurisdictions and states where cannabis has been legalized. The world hasn't fallen apart, and society actually has grown from that. It has benefited from that. And it has taken, cannabis use out of a vacuum of the black market into a regulated system where people make controlled and regulated choices, and that's what we would want to see in Ireland. So that's going to happen in the next 6 months. Just before I go, I want to thank Mark Penny. Mark was doing all the technical stuff behind the scenes here. He's done a brilliant job. So hopefully everybody had an insightful debate and discussion about ending prohibition in Ireland. And hopefully in the next maybe couple of months, we'll come back to this same issue and see. I'm sure we'll have moved on. So thanks everybody for joining tonight, and stay well and keep safe. Thanks very much.